Hello, welcome back to my channel. So today I want to do a video all about the ENTP personality type. I want to talk about their strengths, their weaknesses, and also their cognitive functions. So if you don't know what a cognitive function is, it's going to be really important to this video. So actually Myers and Briggs came after what Carl Jung coined in 1921, which were the 8 cognitive functions. So there's actually, instead of just one type of thinking or one type of feeling, there's actually 2 types of thinking, 2 types of feeling, which those have then been collapsed into the letter dichotomy. So over time it's kind of lost some of its meaning, but it makes it really interesting if you get into cognitive functions. So I have these 8 cognitive functions here. It's by no means exhaustive, but it can be kind of a starting place for which, cognitive function kind of calls out to you, because the online tests are very frequently wrong. So if you just came from like the 16 personalities website, I don't recommend typing yourself in that way. It's just becoming more and more widely known that those tests are very unreliable. So I would learn about the cognitive functions first and then type yourself in that way, and don't become too attached to whatever result you got on an online test. So each of the 16 personalities uses all 8 cognitive functions in a specific order in specific ways, which gives them a very specific flavor. So for the ENTP, this is the order they use their cognitive functions in, and I have the abbreviations listed here too. So loosely speaking, this is descending in order of importance, which of the functions are most important to least important to an ENTP. And also loosely speaking, this is descending chronologically in what order these get developed within the person. So your first function, extroverted intuition's been with you your whole life. Then maybe when you're like teens, 20s, your second function becomes a strength. Then maybe your 30s, your third function comes up, your 40s, your fourth function comes up, and so on and so forth. So by the time, you're like 16 or so, these all 8 functions are working with you in a default way, but they're not necessarily all working as a strength. So to add some nuance to this, your top 4 functions are conscious to you and you value them. Your bottom 4 functions are not valued and they're not conscious. So your top 4 functions, even though maybe they're not all a strength, you still value these things. Maybe you value them in other people, so you choose a partner who has those traits. So to add some more nuance to this, the functions I've listed in green are your potential strengths, and the functions listed in red are your probable weaknesses. So this is people's kind of default state, if you haven't done that much work on things. So your 5th and 6th functions are green, but I wouldn't jump into, using those functions and working on those functions, because like I said earlier, this is still descending loosely in order of importance. So I would start with like your first function, then your second function, then your third, then your fourth. So what I'm going to get into in this video is this matrix here. We have this overused, underused, strength, weakness matrix that I'm going to go into for the top 4 functions of the ENTP. How do these really color the personality? Because since the top 4 functions are conscious and value, there's so much meat to unpack there in the way they affect the personality and how you can kind of play up your strengths, work on your weaknesses to really get results that you want. So if you want to know where I got some of this information, these bullet points here are quotes from Carl Jung, John Beebe, Myers and Briggs about how the different functions play into each other. I'm not going to go into it here, but if you want to pause it and just see what some of these quotes are from the key players, I did go into that in another video, so I'm not going to go into it here, but if you want to pause it, you can. So your first cognitive function is extraverted intuition, or abbreviated NE. So extrovert means to turn outward, vert means to turn, extra means outward. And Carl Jung got the word extrovert and introvert from Benet's words introspection and externospection. It has those same prefixes, but the difference is spect means to watch over. So it's kind of turning outward and watching over what's happening outwardly, or trying to impact the outward environment. And so in this case, it's with the intuition. So there's a lot of things going on outwardly, but in this case, it's the intuitions. So intuitions are things that do not exist yet a lot of times, and then sensing is things that do exist through your 5 senses. So a lot of times with intuition, that can be things like ideas that are not in existence right now. This could be the future, but it's how can you take the things that are not in existence and kind of make those be in existence. So there's a lot about possibilities, brainstorming, ideation. These are kind of some key words for extroverted intuition. So this first function, everyone's first function, is their overused strength. So this is the function that's been with you the longest throughout your whole life. It's who you feel like you are. This is the function that's been with you the whole time. So as a little kid, you should see evidence of yourself using this function. And Carl Jung says that your dominant function, it never stagnates. It's like you have a compulsion to use it. It's the water you swim in. Like you couldn't stop doing this even if you tried. So I just went through and I did deep dives on each of these cognitive functions. They were like 45 minutes long. So a lot of these bullet points come down to quotes from Carl Jung predominantly, and some of them are from Vanderhoop, but most of these are quotes from Carl Jung. And then I've got like an arrow with kind of how I can see this showing up like in America in 2023. So possibilities is a huge word for extroverted intuition. That's the number 1 word, and it was usually used in the plural form, and it was used many times. So expectant possibilities, new possibilities, realized possibilities. So there's this enthusiasm and this radiance for new possibilities when Extroverted intuitives think about change. They think of it as expectant and promising. When they think of a new idea, it's like everything has the seed of future promise, was one of the quotes. So these possibilities, they reaches to many areas of life. Some examples could be, I know many extroverted intuitive doms who have started their own businesses many times over. They went to law school, then they started their own law business, and then they got into the military, and there's a lot of hopping around, even among like baby boomers who didn't do that as much. There's a lot of career hopping, and especially their own businesses, a lot of their own businesses, moving to new cities. I've lived in Idaho, I'm living in San Francisco now, so I've seen ENTPs in different environments, but still what I noticed about a lot of them is they moved away right out of high school. I would say by default, extroverted intuitives are not the type to really stick around. They want the new possibilities, and that extends to where they live. So, not going to a college close to home, but probably going outward and then living in a lot of different cities. I'm thinking of several of them, they lived in San Francisco, and then they lived in Phoenix, and then they went to the East Coast, and then they went to Alabama, and I'm just thinking of a lot of these ENTPs that I know that have moved around. One new possibility that comes especially because they have that TI is I see a huge interest in new technology. I know a lot of ENTPs that are really into Galaxy and not iPhones, and they, hop on the new trends, when VR came out or when like the watches came out, really hopping on new technology really quickly. One quote with extroverted intuition is the initiation of new enterprises. So this comes down to like those new businesses that I was talking about. But I know one ENTP who does sales for ChatGPT, artificial intelligence. So when they see this new technology, it's seen as like exciting, and they want to hop on it, and they see it as, something to really jump on as a great opportunity. I know one who does a VR video game gym. He owns this gym, and so he actually travels around training other people how to do it. So that's something that's really big with them. They're really, really enjoy novelty and creative impulse and change. So one thing I want to say is they love change. There are quotes about how extroverted intuition sees everyday mundane life as a prison, and what's going to let them out of that prison is change. There were lots of quotes about extroverted intuition being very clever, active in mind, ingenious. One thing that I've noticed that they do really well without trying. I would say that school is better designed for some of the J personality types. I think TE and FE do well with external motivation. TI and FI I don't think do as well with external motivation. But even without trying, they're the type, in my experience, as a teacher, they're the type to, procrastinate but still do decently well. Or, they might get C's, but in the conversation, you can tell that they're with it a lot more than maybe some of these students who get A's, but they didn't like fully understand it. And they don't like the system. I knew in high school, I knew an ENTP who he like didn't try for the SAT, but we all had to like take it at school or whatever. So he took it, and then he, we're in a small town in Idaho, but still he did really well. So he ended up getting like a national award for the SAT. He did not try in school. He didn't get good grades or anything. So they wanted to recognize him at the assembly. And when they gave him the mic, that was a mistake to give the ENTP the mic, because he went on this rant about how the school system is broken, how you shouldn't incentivize these things. And, I basically just whole debate. They ended up taking the microphone from him. He didn't go to graduation. He thought that was just kind of a stupid thing to go to graduation. So that's something that comes up. I think it's interesting. They're very non-traditional. Now, I find that a lot of people call themselves non-traditional because when they think of traditional, they think of like, maybe like 1950s culture or whatever. And they say, well, I'm not that, so I must not be traditional. But I'm talking like very non-traditional when I talk about some of these types. So an example of this could be ethical non-monogamy. I mean, I certainly know most of the ENTPs I know are monogamous, but there's this interest in things that are very non-traditional. It's very traditional to have a monogamous relationship, so it's, going a different direction. So this is your dominant function. So a lot of times if you're feeling down or you're not feeling like yourself, you haven't given this function enough opportunity to thrive. It's the function that's been with you throughout your whole life. If you're an extroverted intuitive, you've had this function since you were a child, and so it's something that's really important to make space for this function to, create space for change. I think that this is one of those functions that, combined with some of these other functions can kind of blow things up. It'll kind of just blow the world up because it just wants change so much. And so I think this is a function that can get kind of shunned out. And so it's important to find people who value this function and who are, are willing to hop on these bandwagons with you. So Carl Jung talks about extroversion and introversion give you two different things. So this is your first extroverted function, and it gives you access to the world and action taking, which is so important. So extroversion is not necessarily necessarily like a bunch of dinner parties. Introversion is not watching Netflix alone with your cat, but extroversion is really just, impacting outwardly. So it gives you impact, it gives you access to the world. And your second function, introverted thinking, gives you access to the self and reflection. That's what introversion gives you. So introvert means to turn inward and watch over what's happening inwardly. So like introspection. So it gives you access to understanding yourself deeply and an access to yourself and reflection and really introspection. So if you're, just at home and you're alone and you're watching Netflix or something, that's not necessarily valuable introversion because you're still turning outward and watching the show. Maybe you have an interplay where you then turn inward and process or think, how does this make sense to me? But just the definition of introversion, extroversion is not just like alone or with people, because you could be in a group of people and you could tune them out and be introspecting. Now, it's definitely easier to introspect when you're alone, but it's not, it's not required that you're alone. So your second function is introverted thinking. So introvert means to turn inward, watch over what's happening inwardly. And there's a lot of things you could watch over what's happening inwardly that you could introspect about. But in this case, it's your thoughts, how things make sense to you, distinct from the group, how you process things. So this function, the second function, is everyone's underused strength. This is something that you definitely have a talent for, but it might take some skill building in it. This is the function that comes on the scene when you're like teens, 20s. So a lot of times this function can be neglected. It can really be watered down because you're an extrovert and this function's introverted. So there's a tendency to not want to fully get into this function. There's a tendency to want to morph it into an extroverted thing or to not really do it in its full capacity. But you're an ENTP. So to get rid of this function would mean to get rid of like who you really are. So it's kind of tricky to go there because of the introversion, but really it's something that you want to do because you're a thinker. And Carl Jung talks about this second function adds complexity to this type. When you're first growing up, you just have access to that first function. And then when you become a teenager, then you start having access to all these functions. But really you only have access to, as a strength, the first two at this point in your life. So this adds a lot of complexity and it gets rid of that one-dimensional nature of the individual. So the number one word used with introverted thinking is principles. Principles came up so much by Carl Jung. So some important words associated with introverted thinking are principles, truth, convictions. There are a lot of quotes about there's an exacting scrupulousness, an exactitude. And there are quotes about how their communication style has a lot of saving clauses, qualifications. When you have these saving qualifications, it sounds like it depends, not all the times, but sometimes. And they, include a lot of hedging, which really makes communication very precise. Introverted thinking is quiet, reserved, and detached. And this is very different from extroverted intuition. This is what adds a complexity to the character. It's not a one-dimensional side. So it is quiet, reserved, detached, kind of slow to speak. When you think about this exacting scrupulousness and exactitude with communication, that's very slow to speak, quiet, reserved, and detached. And this is something that's not necessarily part of an ENTP stereotype, because a lot of times this quiet, reserved function gets kind of, watered down or twisted to the extroverted version of itself. But this is definitely a part of ENTPs. And I think as I see ENTPs, 40s and up, let's say, I start seeing a lot more maturity with, the well-roundedness of introversion and extroversion. Carl Jung talks about the dangers of being one-sided. And I have a whole video about that, about, the one-sidedness that extroverts and introverts, the traps they can fall into. But when I see people 40s and up, a lot of times I'm starting to see a lot more maturity and complexity with the way they use these functions. So introverted thinking is skeptical and has a critique of knowledge in general and thought material. So I've seen this can be interests in theology, ethics, apologetics, history, law is something that I see a lot. But they typically, I notice a lot of times they'll have one quite technical interest. I'm kind of in Christian circles, so the ENTPs I know really get into theology and they really get into, Calvinism or predestination or Arminianism, and they really get deep into, apologetics a lot of times. So it's a critique of knowledge in general. So really getting into this knowledge in general and, what do I think about that thing? But TI in general, it's just critiquing knowledge in general. It's not oriented at people. It's not oriented at teams or groups, but it's just, theology in general, ethics in general, apologetics in general. But not attacking people. One of the quotes from, it was either Vanderhoop or Carl Jung, is that introverted thinking can have a great deal to say on subjects, but not being better in practice. So one thing that I'll notice is, I don't notice this when they're in their 40s and up, let's say. This is something that I notice a lot more of people in their 20s, but I know a lot of ENTPs who are the black sheep of their family. And a lot of times it was something that was spurred on in their teens and early 20s. They got kicked out of the house. I know someone had to go to military school. That's something that I've seen a lot, is them being like the black sheep of the family. And it just comes from this introverted thinking, which can have a hubris about it, coming on the scene at a stage of life when you're a teenager and there's already going to be a tendency to have hubris. And so a lot of times this will blow things up for ENTPs and ESTPs, especially with that non-traditional nature and liking change. But then, the TI hasn't really been strengthened yet. And so sometimes the ENTPs will shut off TI altogether and like, you know what, that didn't help me. That had a lot of bad consequences in my life when I got into TI. But as you get through your 20s and as you're getting toward the end of your 20s, that TI is really maturing a lot. And it's not so, teenager-ish, there's just general maturity not related to personality. And so I want ENTPs to stay and be committed to being an introverted thinking. I know that there's a high potential that they feel like it's blown something up in their lives. But I really will make the argument that it's extroverted feeling that has done a lot of it. And introverted thinking has a high level of personal responsibility, high integrity. It corrects its own thoughts. So it's going inward and it's introspecting. Where could I be wrong? What do I think about this? And so it's taking the posture first of, where could I be wrong? So this is the function, everyone's second function. I recommend you, isolate that function and work on it for an extended amount of time. Like 5 years, isolate this function and try to get the most you can out of it, because this is your underused strength. This is, your first function, you're probably already using it. It never stagnates. You're probably using that thing a lot. So this is really your best bang for your buck as a way to really get better as an individual, get some integrity, personal responsibility, turn inward and think, how could I be wrong? And then once you've gone through the work of this over these 5 years, then you can teach people how to also do that as well. Because your first function is like, you're a natural at it, and sometimes it's hard to teach people something you're a natural at. But your second function, you were born, you've got the talent for it, but you have to develop that skill and earn that skill. So once you've seen the pitfalls, then you can teach other people, how to use that function to really think for themselves, to communicate things in a way that's going to be received. It gives a lot of intentional communication. It's quiet, slow to speak, exacting scrupulousness, exactitude. This is a skill that ENTPs could really cultivate. And then the ENTPs I do know that have done this I respect them so much. So this second function is called the parent function by John Beebe. So when you think about a good parent, this is someone who's responsible. They set expectations for themselves. They set expectations for the child. And so this is how you can be a more, responsible person. This is how you set expectations for yourself to make sure that you're not, slack. So there are quotes about this second function lends a lot of range, prospect, and satisfaction. I talk to people who feel like they came home to themselves when they finally got the full strength of their second function, because you're an ENTP. So, to abandon this function is to abandon a huge part of yourself. So now getting on to your third function. Your third function is extraverted feeling, or abbreviated FE. So everyone's third function is the direct opposite of their second function. So since your second function is introverted, this one's extroverted. Since your second one is thinking, this one is feeling. So extroverted feeling, they're direct opposites. So the thing about them being direct opposites is that they're called a polarity. So that's like the North Pole, South Pole, or sometimes the analogy I use it's like a light switch. So the light switch can either be flipped on to TI or it can be flipped down to FE, but the light switch cannot be on and off at the same time. Or North Pole and South Pole. TI is North Pole, FE is South Pole, and you cannot be at the North Pole and the South Pole at the same time. You got to pick. So everyone's third function is their overused weakness. This is a function that it's in the red zone, and it's something that no matter what stage of life you're in, this is something that I notice people going into, and it's because you're an extrovert. This is an extroverted function, so there's some indulgence there. There's a tendency to want to go there. But the issue is that it's a feeling function and you're a thinker. So since that light switch can only be flipped on or flipped off, it can't be both. If you choose to go down to this FE, you're choosing to go away from this TI. You can't be them both at the same time. So if you choose to go to this function because the extroversion is comfortable and indulgent, you're getting rid of who you really are, which is an ENTP, not an ENFP. So John Beebe calls this function the child function. And I had quotes where I told you that you could pause it from those bullet points. But there are quotes about there's cowardice in this function, there's ego, it's kind of haughty. There's can be some hubris in this function. A lot of times people think that they're better at this function than they actually are. And this function really has the energy of a bratty teenager that thinks they know everything. So a lot of times people will go to this function if they're kind of insecure or if they're immature or defensive. This is a function that can really trip people up. A lot of times the good qualities of a function really get twisted and tainted once you get down to this third position. But it's really just marked by immaturity. A lot of times if you are around someone who's really immature, what you're picking up on is an overuse of the third function. So this function is called extraverted feeling. So extrovert means to turn outward and watching over what's happening outwardly. And in this case, it's the feeling environment. What are the values of the group? Are we vibing as a group? Are we in harmony? And harmony is the number one word that Carl Jung used for this function, harmony. And one of the issues with this function Carl Jung talked about is an issue with extroverted feeling is that they can lose sight of their own viewpoint. Now, this is where you get, you might hear the stereotype that ENTPs will argue things that they don't even agree with, or they'll say they're playing devil's advocate, but maybe they're really arguing for their own point. It's just kind of a covert way to say that. And so it kind of loses sight of its own viewpoint. And it's the direct opposite of introverted thinking. Introverted thinking never loses sight of its own viewpoint. It's very certain about its own thoughts. Extroverted feeling has really good people skills. Now, if you put this in a third position, the way this can kind of get tainted is that ENTPs might use dirty emotional tactics or humor to persuade, as opposed to using intellect to persuade. So I'll see a lot of comics that are TI second, FE third. There's a lot of poking fun at other people, really clever, but using that cleverness to kind of persuade people, emotionally. I think a lot of late night talk show hosts are ENTPs, but you can kind of see how they end up using their skills for making fun of people or bullying people. And it's not you don't end up getting the full force of TI, because as soon as you're flipped down to FE, you're doing the opposite of what TI is. So if you really want that, the critique of knowledge in general, and really that, the exacting scrupulousness, that rightness, which TI gives you, you can't be an FE, because as soon as you start getting into this emotional group behavior, you're getting out of the actual rightness. So FE is very community oriented. So the way this can get twisted is it's criticizing groups and people instead of knowledge in general. And this could be political teaming. Now, extroverted intuition is not very traditional. So they're probably less likely to advocate for Democrats or Republicans, but they end up strongly arguing against them. Hey, they're wrong in this way, they're wrong in this way. And the names will get used a lot. Democrats, Republicans will get used a lot. Or they will just criticize groups a lot, or people. One thing that I think ENTPs are not known for is not part of the stereotype, but they can be involved in kind of drama a lot. I think Ethan on the H3 podcast, which is a drama YouTube channel, I think that he is an ENTP, and that's something where you have a lot of FE. This is going to be kind of a drama function. I have the next bullet point is, FE cares a lot about being tactful and appropriate, but the way it can get kind of twisted is this drama or passive aggressiveness, which is definitely not part of the ENTP stereotype to be involved in drama. One issue with extroverted feeling is affectation. So there's insincerity, pose, dishonesty. Extroverted feeling is something that it loses sight of its own viewpoint, and that can go as far as lying. On the far, if we're talking about on the far side, the worst of the offenses of extroverted feeling, there is some dishonesty, trying to appease different people in the room. I've known ETPs, they have a hard time breaking up with people because they just can't stand, it's going to be so hard to, break up with this person or to give bad news to people. And this can lead to dishonesty, this can lead to lying. So something that extrovert feeling can do is it can idealize loved ones. That leads to overlooking fault, denial that there's anything wrong with other people. So one thing that I've been saying in, all the personality types of these videos, that if there's someone who's involuntarily single, so they're single but they don't want to be, a lot of times it comes down to this third function, because people, I think people want to be mature people, they want to find mature people, and a lot of times it's this third function that causes some immaturity in different ways. And so getting into that second function is really what lends so much maturity to the individual. And your second function, like I said, is the parent function, and this one's the child function. So it's important to subordinate this function to introverted thinking and allow introverted thinking to parent this function. Allow introverted thinking to set expectations for extroverted feeling. Extroverted feeling, if you're going to make us charismatic, if you're going to make us, really fun to be around and create harmony in a good group and give me people skills, then that's okay. Okay, we'll use you extroverted feeling in that ways, especially if you're 30s and beyond. But extroverted feeling, we're not going to use you in the sense that, there's drama or using dirty emotional tactics to persuade people, making sure that the order is correctly in balance, because you're an ENTP, not an ENFP. So finally, your fourth function is introverted sensing, and your fourth function is the direct opposite of your first function. Since your first function is extroverted, this one's introverted. Since your first one is intuition, this one is sensing. So introverted sensing is your fourth function. Now this function is your underused weakness. This function is a weakness, but instead of the third function, the reason it's a weakness is because that one's overused. This one's underused. Because since it's the direct opposite of your first function, like that light switch, you can either have the light switch flipped up to NE or flipped down to SI. You can't be in both at the same time. And since your first function is who you feel like you are, it basically never stagnates. It's been with you, your entire life. It makes sense that you would hardly ever have that light switch flipped down, because it's kind of like a no-brainer. It's like your first function is who you feel like you are. It's your number one strength. Your fourth function, John Beebe calls your inferiority complex. You feel really, not good at this thing. So it's kind of a no-brainer that you would just, 95% of the time have it flipped up to extroverted intuition. But that can be an issue because a lot of times people have the belief my first function and my first function only will get me what my first function wants. So in the case of extroverted intuition, this could be possibilities and possibilities only will get me more possibilities. But a lot of times this ends up creating a prison. All the different personality types create a different prison for themselves. And in this case, when you pursue possibilities and pursue possibilities, a lot of times that actually chains you. If a lot of the possibilities, some of the possibilities will work out, some of them won't work out. And a lot of times, that can turn into risky behavior. That could be gambling. It's like, ooh, how could this turn out? What are the possibilities for how this gambling situation could turn out? And then that could turn into debt. And that could, this is kind of an extreme example, but then that ends up imprisoning you. So then because you're in debt, you can't, try more possibilities. You become kind of imprisoned. And so you end up, if you would have just compromised a little bit, you would still get possibilities with a little stability. But then because people don't compromise, they just insist on doing all of their first function, then they end up getting imprisoned to something even worse. It's even, less possibilities than they wanted. So it's important to sprinkle in a little bit of introverted sensing. You don't want to become like an introverted sensing dom. You don't want to use it like 50-50. But if you could use like your first function 80% of the time and this one 20% of the time, or get close to it, not being 95-5. So this function is introverted sensing. So the word introvert means to turn inward and watching over what's happening inwardly. And what it's tuned into is the senses and processing the senses, or, what has existed. If we talk about the difference between intuition and sensing, you've got what doesn't exist and what does exist, to your senses. So this could be an internal processing of like actually how your body's feeling. Am I tired? Am I hungry? Do I need water? Do I need a massage? Really paying attention to your body in that way. There are quotes about introverted sensing being really aware of and having fine-tuned sensory organs, but also an internal processing of your experience is pretty much like combing through your memories. So turning inward, how did this impact me? You've got this Rolodex of all of these things which have built up to, all these chapters of your life and how things have informed you. So there were a few words used with introverted sensing that Carl Jung used. Reserved was one, traditional is one that gets thrown around. Archaic is another one, seeing things through a million-year-old consciousness, that's a quote, or seeing things through an archaic lens. So it's a very past-oriented lens. A word that I use sometimes is timeless. It's got a timeless value, what's not, not fads, but, what has long-standing value over the course of, millions of years. So one thing, if someone doesn't have enough introverted sensing, they can like forget to eat or sleep. It talks about the extroverted intuitives, when they get on this new idea, they get like fixated on it and they completely forget about eating or sleeping. So an action step, I've got this arrow here. I've done a few, I know in ENTP and ENFP as well, something I wouldn't associate with an ENTP stereotype, but I do know an ENTP who did this as well. Getting into bullet journaling, and especially to track routines in the body. Introverted sensors, typically are very good with like cleaning routines, or, getting a certain amount of steps in a day, or drinking enough water, kind of tracking. But the bullet journaling allows you to change, you get to design your own spread, you get to design what it looks like, so there's kind of some creativity involved, but you're also tracking some bodily routines. Not enough introverted sensing can rebel against any obligation, but introverted sensing is described as very responsible. So this allows you to, follow through. One thing with extroverted intuition is it might start a project and then it starts another project and it starts another project. And they talked about that when you leave things so quickly, you don't stay to like reap the rewards of it. You were there for the planting, but then someone else stayed behind and they get the rewards of, what you left. So, it might feel like it's like an obligation, like stick around, it's so boring, this prison, but, you actually get a lot more rewards from it. Extroverted intuition is described, one of the bad traits with it is being very evasive or abandoning things. There was a quote about they abandon things apparently without remembrance. And so that's part of it, it could be, might not be, but the moving from city to city could be, abandoning things. It could be running from consequences, or, this just felt like a prison, so now I've got to leave it. Just blowing your life up multiple times over. It might not be, but it could be. And introverted sensing is a lot more loyal. It's a lot more stable. And a lot of times the stability that introverted sensing gives you, if you've got money routines and cleaning routines and kind of all this boring, just like everyday life stuff, if you get that under control, then you have a lot more opportunity for possibilities. It kind of creates this safe container to springboard all these possibilities. So a quote with extroverted intuition is they're easily bored with this life prison. So one thing that I think of if you want to mold extroverted intuition and introverted sensing together is you could try like a new routine each month. So maybe you want to work on your body. You feel like your body, your physical shape is kind of slipping, but it's just so boring to go to the gym and do the exact same thing every day. One thing is you could try a new routine. Like, so for a month, you try dance class, then the next month you go to a different gym, and the next month you go to a different gym. So you keep the routine, so every day you're still showing up. but you're trying new things. Introverted sensing, it's receptive to things of lasting value, things that are timeless. A lot of times it's an interest in history. I have this image on the right, which is supposed to depict, something history related. I know a lot of ENTPs that are very interested in history, or when they travel, liking to go to historical things within that city. Especially if they're older, this is a function that really gets prioritized a lot more, starting like 40s and up. So this is something that becomes really important. Yeah, so it's interesting the contrast here, where you got extroverted intuition, which I notice a lot into like ChatGPT or like VR, and then you got introverted sensing, which is a lot more history oriented. So they're very different. Introverted sensing lends a routine, a warmth, and a coziness. So making your home and your space very cozy, appealing to your senses. A comfy couch with comfy pillows, candles if that's appealing to the senses. But just sprinkling in a little bit of this. And one thing with introverted sensing is they have long-standing relationships and projects. So a lot of times with introverted sensors, the quote, the issue with introverted sensors, their quotes are how they do the same old thing in the same old way year after year. So the negatives of that is not enough change, but the pros of that is you end up reaping a lot of rewards. Like I was talking about with that metaphor, when you plant things and then when you stick around, you get the rewards. When I was teaching with a lot of ISJs, and they had been at the school for 20 years, and then students are coming back and they're so grateful. Wow, you're my favorite teacher. Meanwhile, I've since left. And so you don't get any of the appreciation, when you leave things so much. And they just, they got in the groove and they got better and they got better and they got better with teaching as the years went on. Sticking with things, with one job for a long time or one city for a long time. It requires like some difficult conversations. It requires, the first instinct can't be to evade or abandon. And it takes a lot of bravery to, stay with something, to make peace with the past, to make peace with your family. Because family is one of those things of long-standing value. And I see, a trend that I see with the ENTPs is really having ruptured family relationships, with their parents. And then as they're getting around to their 40s, or as their parents are, their health is not getting better, or their parents are about to be the age where they pass away, then I see them, making peace with their parents. And so I think that that's something of long-standing value. If you're going to make peace with them anyways, on their deathbed, you might as well do it now. That's, family is something that has long-standing value. Unless things, are really awful, I think there's, something you can do to, make it better. So, I've got the broom for cleaning. I've got this little planner that could represent like a bullet journal, someone canning things. Focus on the changing of the seasons, curled up with a book. It's nice and cozy. You're reading the book and then you're turning inward and reflecting about, what you think, maybe journaling about the day, reflecting on the day. If you do a bullet journal, a lot of the times if you can do things retrospectively, like processing the day and internal processing of things, history, so you can kind of like sprinkle in to your life a little bit more stability and emphasis on like routine and chores, all the boring stuff. So a lot of times I notice that people's fourth function is completely absent because it's the opposite of who you feel like you are. And then all of a sudden there'll be a big spike in this function and they go back to not using it at all. So that's called the grip. When there's this big spike of the fourth function, especially when it's happening to you, you're not intentionally cultivating it. It's just something you feel like you don't have control over and it's just happening to you. And a lot of times that's in periods of a lot of stress, usually short-lived, like maybe, a couple weeks max. I would say grips are usually relatively short term. It could be longer term. So this might be getting all of a sudden really into routines and really into chores and really into this stuff. And then, it's gone a couple weeks later. So as opposed to, this absent and then spike, raising that a little bit most of the time so there's not this oscillation between extremes. One quote that I've heard is that you don't know someone until you know their fourth function. Like maybe when you first get introduced to someone, you meet their first function, then you meet their second function, then third, or, the order might vary a little bit. But a lot of times your fourth function is, it's really hidden. So you're not really friends with someone until you've met their fourth function. Like that's when you go from acquaintances to actually deep friends, is when you finally meet this fourth function. And I'm always so grateful when people show me this fourth function. I'm always so surprised, I think ENTPs, like, when I first meet them, I meet the part of them that's like, oh, I have my own law business, or I do sales for ChatGPT or something. But over time, then if you get closer to them, then it's like, oh, I'll cook you dinner. Or, it's a very, it's a sensory thing with the food, and it's this really like different side to see that type of thing. So this fourth function kind of whispers at your life purpose. It's not your life purpose in and of itself, but it will kind of whisper in that direction. What can you do of timeless value, related to introverted sensing, something related to your past experiences. How did you process your past experiences? You realize what was of timeless, lasting value, and then that's informing who you are right now. So I think, I really recommend people work on their second function for an extended amount of time, like 5 years. And then once you've really worked on that function, you've got the quiet, reserved, exacting with the language and everything. Once you really have introverted thinking under control, then you can sprinkle in some introverted sensing, work on that for a couple years. And it has less bang for your buck than introverted thinking because this is still in the red zone, and it's probably always going to be relatively in the red zone, but especially 40s and up, this function gets a lot better. I have really enjoyed ENTPs. This is a story that's kind of embarrassing or vulnerable for me to tell, but it's something that I think really honors ENTPs, and so I want to, I'll embarrass myself for the sake of honoring ENTPs to show them, what's really valuable about what they do. When Garrett and I first started dating, so I met his dad, and his dad is an ENTP. And I had just grown up in this very conservative Christian environment. And in that environment, they don't really teach you to question things that much. And which is TI's bread and butter, which is what TI really teaches people. And for some reason, I was wanting to impress Garrett's dad. And, this is such an embarrassing story because the audacity for me to say this is just, it's cringy. But I had told his dad, I was like, you know what, and I just want you to know that if Garrett and I ever have a disagreement, Garrett is the man, and I will submit to him. And his dad, being the ENTP, he's just like, oh, well, hold it right there. He's like, we don't need to go that far. We don't need to be in some 1950s society. You guys need to have an equal partnership where you both speak about things. And I remember going home and thinking about that, and I was like, wow, I'd never really heard anyone kind of question the general narrative. And then once he had kind of brought that up, then I was just thinking about things, and I was like, oh, I don't know if this is even really making sense. And, it's embarrassing for me to think about now, but that's something that I think is really valuable, and I think it really changed, the way that I live my life. I mean, I just think I'm so disgusted with myself, just to think about how I could have lived if someone had just briefly challenged the status quo. I think the status quo needs to be challenged so much of the time, especially in a kind way. I think about these two examples of the ENTPs, that was really a kindness, especially if I was going to go into my marriage thinking that I need to submit all the time and that I'm never right and the husband's always right, just, by mere fact of gender. That was going to have really bad consequences on the way that I lived my life if, the ENTP hadn't done me the kindness to be well, let's challenge this for a second, and I'm just embarrassed to admit that I honestly hadn't thought about that being wrong. I was just I think I was too much in introverted feeling, and I was thinking about, okay, I need to find fault in myself. Where am I guilty? Okay, of course I wouldn't want to submit. Who wants to submit? So that's just a fault within myself. I need to get rid of that fault within myself. It's not fun to do that, and it's not fun to admit that you're wrong all the time, but that's something I need to do. And so I just kind of rationalized it in this FI guilt moral way that I would just be selfish if I ever thought I was right. And so it's just, it's just this whole really toxic environment that I don't think was explicitly taught, but apparently was somehow, because of, where I'm at this, where I eventually came to. So yeah, I really appreciate ENTPs. I think they're such a fun type. I feel like I've said this in all the videos. The ETPs, I feel like they're OP. They have all of the fun, the smart, the people skills. They got all the skills I value all wrapped up in one. So yeah, if you want more videos about ENTPs, I will have my ENTP playlist linked in the description box. In that playlist, there's videos about ENTPs, the deep dives into these cognitive functions. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. Bye.